12. 1, 2, 2. One, two, 3, 4. The second is
Good afternoon and welcome to today's joint webinar hosted by ACCP Transplant PRN and AST Transplant Pharmacy COP. I am Kristen Semprich and it is my pleasure to moderate today alongside Jamie Schulte. Today's webinar is the first in a series of professional development webinars, and we are looking forward to kicking it off with this session on research. In a moment, I'll turn it over to our speakers to begin the presentation, but first, here are a few quick notes. For our audience members, please ensure your microphone remains muted for the duration of today's presentation. The mute button is located in the lower left-hand corner. If at any point during the presentation you have a question for the speaker, please submit your question by using the chat functionality at the bottom of your screen. We will take the questions at the completion of the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar that are not fixed by logging out and refreshing your internet connection, please make Jamie and I aware through the chat functionality.
Thanks, Kristen. So welcome everyone. This session is going to focus on 3 components of the research process that we're hoping will help to provide insight and examples on ways to foster successful research endeavors, no matter what level of experience you have. The first is going to be tools and methods of incorporating student and resident trainees in research projects with some focus points on feasibility and effective timelines. We'll also hear from our panelists on successful paths to collaboration and a discussion on getting your research to the finish line. Excitingly, this webinar is now also available for CE credit. We will be taking attendance today and we'll send out an email at the completion of the presentation. The email will include instructions on how to obtain CE credit. The webinar will also be posted on the ACCP Transplant YouTube channel after the CE window closes. You can see our CE objectives here, which include describing effective approaches to leveraging learners, identifying steps involved in the research collaboration process, and reviewing techniques in getting your manuscript published.
We have a wonderful group of panelists here today, all with extensive and unique research experience. First, we have Jamie Park, who is a clinical pharmacist specialist at the University of Michigan and also a clinical professor at the University of Michigan College of Pharmacy. To highlight some of her accomplishments for research, she has over 60 peer-reviewed journal articles published, as well as over 40 abstracts and poster presentations, and has co-investigated over 10 research and service grants, since 2000. I'll now turn it over to Jamie to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I will be discussing how to incorporate learners in your research program. And I will start out with how to find a student investigator and how to generate feasible project ideas and effective timelines. And when you have different levels of learners, how you can place in appropriate roles based on their abilities. So we all have worked with a resident on research project, and either as a resident, as a trainee, or junior mentor, or even seasoned mentor. So we have already access to residents who are looking for a research project every year. But if you are interested in expanding your learner pool for your research program to students, and if you are regular faculty at the college, you probably have a familiarity to their PharmD curriculum. If you are adjunct faculty and precept PharmD student on your rotations, and I highly encourage you to contact your contact at the college. And the chances are there may be already a required research course or honors or capstone project or even MUE and QI project as a part of other courses. The schools are looking for faculty mentors desperately to mentor PharmD students as part of a regular coursework. Or there may be opportunity for you to create an elective course for the research if you really want to devote yourself into the PharmD student research program. Also, anecdotally, individual pharmacy students may email you to find extracurricular research experience over the summer or longitudinally through the semester and year. And if you're working with physicians and nurses and who also involved in their discipline students' research training, you may be invited to co-mentor their students as well. Next slide, please. What are some tips is because we want this research experience to be meaningful for your learners and yourself as well. So be intentional depending on the course objectives and what is the final requirement for the learning experience. And we want them to develop foundational research knowledge and critical thinking skills. And with that experience, hopefully we can foster their interest and comfort level in future research activities. And also it would be really great to have some tangible outcomes, poster presentation, abstract, or even manuscript publication so that the learners can put on their CV, in turn make them stronger candidates for their post-graduating training applications or even job search. And in the beginning, it will be very important to set clear and reasonable expectation about each one's roles and responsibility and potential outcomes out of the research project. And Dr. Lickbaugh will talk about what would that be, and if you have more than one person working in research team as a collaborators. Moving on. So when the research project starts with coming up with questions, right? And how I define the research is if you need a data collected and analyzed to answer a question, that's research. And in our everyday practice, we have all of these questions coming up, popping up everywhere, right? And there are some therapies we use, but there's no published data. And perhaps you can research about it. And we implemented a new service and new protocol, new process in your practice. Maybe you can compare and pre and post and what was the improvement you made. And you see a problem in your current practice, either patient outcome is not good, or maybe we are not using the medication appropriately, and you want to develop a new service and you need benchmark data, right? So that can be a research too. And also we are asked by our institution to do medication evaluation project as well. And you can incorporate your learners into MUE. So once you have an idea, you have to formulate that into research question or hypothesis you can test and study about. Many of you must be familiar with PICO and final criteria. This is a great framework to convert your research idea into the question. I'm not going to go through this, but there are great resources out there, and you can share that as a guide to your learners that you mentor, or even you use this as refresh your memory. And these are, next slide, Christine. And these are some of the common study designs that we utilize in our typical student and resident project. And the resources can go over that. Next slide, please. And now you have a project idea, and let's come up with a timeline. There are a lot of components that you need to consider to develop an effective timeline. And this is also a great opportunity for your resident to think about their priorities, prioritization and time management skills. So what drives our timeline? What is our end goal? And do we have any institutional timeline, or abstract and manuscript submission timeline, or residency project timeline? All of those milestone timelines you need to think about and map out. And each step of the research project, starting with the IRB approval, protocol development, data collection and analysis, and then manuscript development also require time. And you want to have some idea about what each step takes so that you don't spend 12 months and have an unfinished project at the end. Let's move on and use the example. So I'm going to use the 1-year resident research project as an example. Resident starts on July 1st and they graduate June 30th. And we want to submit a peer-reviewed manuscript at the end of residency. But before they come on July 1st, your work as a research mentor starts probably 4 or 5 months earlier. So you probably want to think about, brainstorm, what would be the research project idea for next year? And then you also think about, what is the sample size? Is it feasible? Do I need other collaborators? Do I need a statistician in my team? And so you want to do all of this homework and formulate your project idea. And a large residency program like UOBAM, we actually have to submit our project ideas about 2 months ahead of time so that the residency advisory committee can review them as for feasibility and as well as workload balance for the preceptors. So this is actually a good deadline to have so that you can be more proactive. Okay. One of the steps that require a lot of time that is out of our power is probably waiting for IRB approval. So I highly encourage you for resident project mentors to have IRB approval obtained before your patient or your resident arrive on July 1st. And know your IRB. What's the average time it takes to approve? Or some of the IRBs actually don't require any full review of IRB application because it's retrospective review, or they let you allowed to have umbrella IRB, so you don't have to submit separate IRB for each different project. So that's something to think about to improve your efficiency and productivity. Next step is another time-consuming one is data collection, right? So typical residency project, you have to present your final results in spring, either internally to your department or a regional residency conference, right? And so residents usually start collecting data in September after their protocol is developed, and do most of the December months to collect data and analyze in January and February, have the final results ready by the spring. However, we have ATC abstract submission in first week of December. Let's move the slide, Christine. So that means you have to move up your data collection. You have to move up your IRB, right? So think, depending on your sample size, if your residents start collecting data, maybe August, and 3 months may not be enough to complete data collection. That means you need another help to collect data, probably way before July 1st. So some of us have been very creative, and we already created different models so that we can layer learners to have timely data analysis done before ATC abstract. And some use research elective rotation, some use a flipped model, some use a layered model. So I'm going to discuss layered model in the next slides. So if you have different levels of runners, say that you have students combined with PGY1 and PGY2 or PGY2 residents. And I think any level of learners can participate in data collection with a minimum requirement completed. So those are institutional requirement for research ethics and compliance training, as well as HIPAA. And they should have some familiarity with electronic health record if you're doing retrospective review and have some clinical context. So something to think about is first-year pharmacy students may not have all of those, and perhaps your target learner to include on your project if it required the last two steps, probably second and third year pharmacy student, okay? And the residents should be expected to create a database on their own with some guidance about the Excel and RedCap. And they should have some knowledge and skills to do descriptive statistics, although more advanced statistical support can be provided by statistician or research mentor. And residents should be expected to write a draft manuscript. And with advanced students, they can even write part of the manuscript if they have desire and commitment with appropriate guidance. And lastly, if you have multiple team members on your research team, someone need to be have a role of a project manager. It could be you, the principal investigator or senior investigator, or if you are collaborating with a junior clinician or a resident, and they can be the point person and they can train others like students and other learners coming on the project. So you can think about each learners' previous experience and interest and who's in your research group, and hopefully place them in an appropriate role within the role. So that concludes my section, and Dr. Lickber will continue.
Thank you, Jamie. Our next panelist is Alicia Lickbar, who is a clinical pharmacist specialist at UC San Diego Health. Some of her accomplishments include completing fellowship in solid organ transplant research, over 35 published articles, and over 60 poster presentations. She has also been involved in multiple funded research projects. So next, I'll hand it off to Alicia.
So you'll have to excuse me. The picture looks very nice. I'm moving today, so you get a Tommy Bahama chair and whatever this wonderful athleisure is today. I'm hoping to just kind of talk to you about some of my favorite papers, some of the collaborative efforts that I've had over the years, and how you can kind of build that network for yourself as well. Next slide. So for the most part, three major points that I'm going to get across to you guys today. So describing the learning path, the paths that lend themselves to research collaboration. To quote a viral meme, it just doesn't fall out of a coconut tree. Discuss the collaboration and key communication pieces necessary for successful multi-center collaboration, and then talk about some of the regulatory considerations that you have to think about in terms of doing any multi-center work. Next slide. So finding your research team is actually one of the most important things when it comes to any research, just like Jamie had mentioned from her first set of slides as well. For me, thinking about the collaborative process, I actually used to run in college. I was a D1 athlete. Teamwork was really important for me. And there are a lot of ways you can get it in the transplant community. Each of these individual columns, first we have the AST/TX Farm COP. And there's been a lot of work and a lot of paper efforts that have come out of the different work groups, from public policy, medication access, the TPAC, and then research innovation, a prime for research collaboration and finding a team of people. Where I've had kind of the most success as my own individual person has actually been the ACCP Transplant PRN, specifically through the research committee, which I think was what got me initially into doing some multi-center collaborative work with people across the country, but then also the workforce committee. And then for myself within my own individual scouting and seeking out, thinking about networking opportunities. I know one of our research precepting papers that was published a couple years back was really I was introduced to a critical care pharmacist at MUSC who shared a similar view when it came to incorporating learners. Okay, so reaching out to them and wanting to write a paper. Past coworkers and committee members, I found that as I've worked with people on committees, that we've lent really well to creating great teams. That's how I've written a lot with Jamie Park over the years. When I was a fellow, she was the chair of the research committee, and then she's been really stuck with me ever since. And then lastly, institutions. So at the University of California, for example, we have the UC CoLab where all of our California institutions can collaborate to do multi-center patient-focused research. Next slide. So questions I like to ask myself if I'm the one that's endeavoring or thinking about doing something that is outside the scope of just a single center study. When I'm recruiting for a team, I think about what skills I need to recruit to the project that maybe I can't provide, or maybe I don't have bandwidth to provide. And that's really, once I identify the project, where I start first is okay, well, who would be really good to speak to these different project aspects or elements? And then what perspectives do I need to elevate this research? For example, just as I've transitioned from the East Coast to the West Coast, there's a lot of different ways to practice transplant pharmacy, to think about patient care. So what external institutions might be worth recruiting from for a paper, for example, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in the slides, thinking, for example, about Anne from Baylor. I loved her model that she created there. So when we were thinking about doing an AmCare survey, she was one of the voices that I really wanted to be a part of that project. And with that, what centers have a perspective or approach that's advantageous to this work? So that's where I really lean into looking at the listserv, seeing if there's different things that come across the listserv from institutions that might lend itself to the work that we might be interested in doing. And then just, what personalities do I work best with? I is an extremely extroverted individual that has the attention span of a gerbil on the best of days. That caters to a certain personality. And I'll use Jamie as an example. I need Jamie's resolve and focus on papers. It elevates any paper that I'm working with. So finding personalities that you mesh with, that you write well with, lends itself to creating a really cohesive team that has a shared vision. Next slide. So along with that roadmap, when we think about, okay, how do we assemble this team? Again, starting from the ground is identifying a research project or a paper. A lot of this comes from either clinical experience, boots on the ground. What's missing as, I've gotten more into service building and more into kind of the larger scale of how can I get FTEs approved? That frustration of we need more. How do I demonstrate that? is where I've been getting a lot of my ideas from lately, along with listserv avenues as well. Again, finding stakeholders is just really, really important. Finding the right ones is important. And you have that through trial and error, but I've been very fortunate to pick up and create really successful research writing teams along the way. When I reach out to them, not everybody is available. You know, everybody leads very busy lives. So I always send an introductory email of like, hey, this is my project. Sometimes if I'm really stretched for time, you get a very like half thought out text. It's like, what about this? Interested? Followed up by a more formal email that talks about timeline and what I envision that collaborators' roles and responsibilities and where I see them and why I think they fit into the team. Explaining the why, usually if I'm really interested in having them, that's a critical part of the ask that I think is important to incorporate, because that's going to help set the table of their expectations of what to experience in the scope of this project. From there, once I have an initial team of yeses, I bring them all together and we have an initial meeting to go over major project touch points and milestones. So that could look like a really messy brainstorming session for protocol, a research outline, talking about the IRB submission process. I like to take lead just because I'm most familiar with the IRB at my own center. I don't wish doing IRB paperwork on anyone but myself. So talking about who does that, I think is important. I use the first meeting to also talk about authorship and authorship order discussion. I'm, for example, not in academia anymore. My position on papers doesn't mean a whole lot to me because I don't get extra money or extra clout for it within my institution. And so, you know, anyone with academia appointments or where that's used in their infrastructure for annual performance reviews, I let people let that be known so we can prioritize them higher, maybe delegate more to them throughout the project. And then usually just come up with it. Hey, okay, no one has a preference. This will be first, this will be last, and then alphabetical in between. But just so everybody has buy-in and it's very transparent from the jump. Timeline of project. This is as a new homeowner. I'm learning that much like home ownership projects, you have a timeline and then you actually have what happens. I can talk a little bit about that with some of the papers that will be examples on the next subsequent slides, but you have a basic timeline. I try to be conscientious of what are busy times for people who have obligations with their residents, who have obligations with their academia teaching loads, things like that, and work around the timeline. It's flexible, again, because being just on the hospital side, this is just most of these papers are just for funsies for me. So I don't have a hard deadline, but others might, or others might have stronger preferences. So we use this time to talk about it. And then lastly, finding ways to have recurrent meetings. If you do not have recurrent meetings, your project is pretty much dead in the water, and it's not going to go anywhere. You need the momentum. So creating momentum with the recurrent meetings is critical. I usually say every 2 weeks to start, sometimes more aggressive, and those can be spaced out and changed as the project evolves, but you really need that initial momentum. Next slide. So with all of that comes things to be very aware of, and that's IRB and the regulatory needs that come along with multi-center national collaborative endeavors. I like to just I'm lazy. I don't let Kristen's like bio slide fool you. I'm a lazy person. Lazy person says, what do I need to do to not do all the IRB paperwork? And that is review articles and systematic reviews, and then finding ways to create exempt research. Listserv surveys are a really great example of that, but basically, what are ways that I can write with my friends that doesn't require me to get lawyers involved, basically. if you are doing clinical research, I will warn you, if you think your taxes are bad, boy, buckle up, because there's a lot of paperwork and there's oftentimes a lot of lawyers involved. Baseline, make sure everybody's just up to date on their city training. You're going to need their certificates, I promise you. But be aware that with this paperwork, there's also a lot of legal agreements that kind of come into play and a lot of contracts. So with that, you have, for example, just this very exhaustive list of non-disclosure or disclosure agreements, data transfer, data use agreements. If you're getting into harder lab samples, equipment loans and master agreements, if you're sharing software, say, someone needs access to, Stata or SAS, and that's under, your contract budget to provide that software, you can share it with other people from different institutions. And there's a software licensing agreement that comes with that. And there's different teaming agreements. When in doubt, ask your IRB. They know. I am not a lawyer. Absolutely not. So when in doubt, I just ask my IRB, explain to them the project, and then have them kind of guide me through a paperwork as necessary. Next slide. All right, so some brief storytelling examples. I'm contractually obligated to talk about this paper every time I speak now. It's one of my favorite papers. It's one of the last papers I got to write with Rita, which is always a gem. This paper was actually born out of working as the transplant PRN chair, where basically a group of us said, hey, we should probably update the paper that happened 10 years ago. A lot's changed. And so we had a collaborative endeavor, not only through ACCP, but AST, where we hand selected leadership within the transplant community to come together and write this paper. Everybody wrote their own sections. There was a lot of wordsmithing along the way, but this was, think of a more higher umbrella, like collaborative endeavor. Next slide. This is I don't want to do IRB paperwork, but I also want to write with my friends paper. Came out of the ACCP Transplant PRN as well. But for us, we wanted to have something that was reflective of the navigating the opioid crisis that was ongoing and has been ongoing within our country, and talking about transplant's role in it and how there really wasn't a good handle on a lot of opioid minimization research, despite a lot of centers trying to embark on it. So through the PRN, we had some key stakeholders, myself, Jen, Chrissy, and Lindsay were all members of the PRN executive board at the time. And then we found ad hoc members to participate in this paper as well. This is a paper that I'll use as a timeline is very flexible. I think 2 babies were birthed over the course of this paper. We've had family deaths. I moved across the country. So we had basically everything everywhere all at once happen that impacted the timeline of this paper. But we continue to push forward, I think really only by the grace of having those recurring meetings, and then having just Heather be our primary author, and just the leadership that she showed through it. Next slide. This is a database example. This is I did a project with Angelica Gressner, who houses the International Transplant Pancreas Transplant database. And this is a PGY2 project, and we needed her to help us with comparative statistics to the database. So with this, we had to get lawyers involved. We had multiple data use agreements. It changed the landscape of how we were able to collect data and what data endpoints we could use within that contract without it involving a lot of lawyers and a lot of time, by the merits of the resident research project. So as you think about these projects, again, to harken back to what Jamie said, timeline is very important. Next slide. And then the most recent was just a survey research example, an example of exempt research, doesn't require the data use agreement. I would be the only person that would have access to the data as that was the one that did like the statistical research. And so a lot less time intensive as it came to IRB and whatnot. But really, this is a culmination of people that I have either worked with in the past. For example, Helen, Aoife, Dana. I went to school with Georgina at Pitt, and then people that I've just have great respect for in their clinical practice. So Anne, Lindsay, Chrissy, and so I just assembled a team that made sense, that could speak to all the aspects and elements and corners of the paper that we really wanted to elucidate with this survey. So again, same principle, less paperwork with data use agreements, but the spirit of creating team is still very much there. Next slide. And I think that's it. Awesome. Thank you guys so much, and I look forward to your questions at the end.
Thank you, Alicia. Next, we have two speakers. We have Margaret Jorgensen, who is a clinical pharmacist specialist for abdominal transplantation and infectious diseases at UW Health. She has 79 publications since 2011 and 67 since 2020. She's a co-investigator on 4 clinical trials and also a principal investigator for 2 industry-funded clinical trials as well. With her, we have Jillian Descorray-Oates, who is a clinical pharmacist specialist in abdominal transplantation at UW Health. She also has extensive research experience with over 50 publications and over 45 poster presentations, and has co-investigated on 2 clinical trials, as well as being a member of a data monitoring safety committee. So both of them will be speaking about the 3rd section of today's presentation.
Thanks for the introduction, and I was so honored to be able to have a chance to talk with Jillian. I agree completely with Alicia. You know, finding your team is very important, and you know, once you got somebody that you work very well with, you know, try to stick with them because you can be very productive in that way. So you have great ideals, you know, you got a project, you really love it. You know, this is going to answer a very important clinical question. And you follow Jamie Park's lovely timeline. You made all your timeline at the time that it was required. Your resident was involved. You worked with all your friends, and then you submitted it to a journal. So how do you decide which journal to submit to? And I'm going to ask Jillian, you know, like, what do you usually think about when you try to decide which journal?
All right, so I would say, you know, stepping off of that, we have to really step back and look at your project. So you have to think like, how good was the quality? How big was the scope? Like, what type of project are we talking about? And I think that can be tough sometimes because you're so closely tied to it. You think it's a really great project. You put all your hard effort into it, but you have to think on a bigger picture. Like, has something on this topic been published? Do you feel like you're going to be the first one sharing this information? And these questions can help give you an idea of how, in a sense, valuable your data is. So if you think this is a really high quality, valuable project, you always want to shoot high. But if you think maybe this is just like a review of a resident project, there's some other data out there, you know, you're probably not going to publish it in AST or something, or AJT. So usually we also then, on top of the quality of the work, would look at the topic. So is this just purely pharmacy? Obviously, then you're most likely going to approach a pharmacy journal. Is it an infectious disease topic? Maybe then you'd want to do like transplant infectious disease. Or is it a broad transplant project and you would want to approach something like clinical transplant? Our approach is always to shoot high and then to have some backups, because you want to try to get your data in the highest quality journal you can, but there's always a chance they're going to reject it, and you shouldn't let that deter you. So having kind of a backup in line of where you're going to go to next. I think that kind of sums it up for picking a journal. I'll punt it back to May to say, so now you've submitted it to your journal, you pick the highest one, you think your project is really great, you submitted to Transplant Infectious Disease, and now they came back to you saying they have 12 comments for you, and maybe they'll accept it, maybe they don't. And so maybe May can talk about both of those. What do you do when they say, we accepted it with all these revisions, but the list can be daunting, there's 20 revisions to make, or they say we just rejected it. So how's that stage go?
Right. So that's always hard. And I think the important thing is you have to give yourself some grace. Like, obviously, as pharmacists, we always think our projects are, amazing, awesome. How did nobody ever think of this before? And then, maybe when you're submitting it, you're like, yes, finally, HAT is going to think this is great. I'm turning it in. And then they say rejected within 72 hours. So, that can really hit hard, and you got to go through all your stages of grief. You got to be angry. This is great, and then sad about it. But the most important thing is to never give up, because just because it wasn't a good fit at the first journal you tried certainly doesn't mean that it wouldn't be a good fit at another journal. And we always talk about starting with the higher tier journals, and then moving down the line. But of course, sometimes you can submit at a lower tier journal or the journal of your choice, like perhaps you're doing an infectious disease type of research project, and then you submit it to TID and it's rejected. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't necessarily be accepted or applicable in clinical transplantation or even transplantation, which would be considered a higher tier journal. So you just got to know that, it's your first shot at it and it's not time to give up. Now, if you have the good fortune of getting accepted with major revisions, like, yes, that is very daunting and you wish they would just accept it, but that is actually quite rare. So the thing to remember is the first part of that, accepted, and not the second part, the major revisions. So when you get that email, you have to applaud yourself and your efforts. Then you can close the email. Then you come back to it later, like maybe a day later. You reread all the email, everything that they say in it that you need to change, you need to modify, how crushing it can be. Close the email again, open it up a week later, then start transcribing over their comments into some sort of form. You don't have to answer the questions yet. That can be very overwhelming because there's many different things and you might not know where to get started. But the best thing to do is just transcribe it into the document that you will submit as your reviewer responses. Then work with your colleague and collaborators, try to divide up who is going to respond to which parts, maybe based on, who wrote which parts. And then take the time that's needed to respond to the reviewer comments, reread it, make sure that you always respond in a very congenial way. You don't want to be too sassy because they're the ones that hold the power to accept your paper or decline it. And then, you'll find that you've overcome this barrier and it really wasn't that big of a problem as long as you're, taking it step by step. And I think an important thing too is, moving back to Jamie's timeline, when you start in the beginning with the project and you have your resident and you have your team, you should really start outlining the paper. Because a lot of these things, like with some experience that the reviewers start asking about, if you're writing the paper in the very beginning, you can think about them the way a reviewer would, rather than you as the researcher who's very close to the project might think about them. So you make sure that you define all your methods and your definitions of things. The outcomes are very clear, the primary objective. These are common things for peer reviewers to ask about. And then if it comes back and it says accepted, with more major revisions, repeat the process over. And really, it can take a really long time. The peer review, especially, it always seems a little bit slower in the summer, but it can be 3 months that it's under peer review. It comes back to you. They ask for many more analyses. You have to get in touch with your statistician. You have to collect more data. They usually give you about 2 months to respond to the reviewers. You submit it and then it's another 3 months. So it can get in the way of your timeline, but the important thing to remember is you're doing it, you're climbing up the mountain. It's very slow, but don't give up.
So that's good, but what about when it's rejected? So that is a little bit of a different, you know, roadblock, I would say. And so for me, you know, that can be very daunting, like, especially when you think back to you're a resident and someone rejected your paper and you're like, oh my gosh, this project, I spent all this time, it's rejected. And you just want to give up, kind of to May's point of like the feelings of grief. But I think you have to step back and think, do you really think this is a project that would benefit people? Do you think what you learned is beneficial for the pharmacy or transplant or whoever your audience, you know, the general public to benefit from? And if so, you kind of have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, take some of the reviewer comments. A lot of times when you're rejected, they still give you reviewer feedback, and look at it and think, okay, maybe they have a good point. Maybe the way I wrote this paper wasn't the best way. Maybe I can take the comments, you know, remold it and resubmit it somewhere else. Do you have tips, May, for how you handle if something's rejected?
Yeah, one thing I would say is if you are accepted with peer review comments, then definitely address all those comments. But if you're rejected, you think the way that your paper was written was, you know, methodologically sound and, you know, good research technique, like, don't waste your time with those comments. Don't let them bring you down. Like, sometimes they have good things to offer, and certainly, like, you know, if you're rejected from transplantation and they say, well, did you know that Dr. So-and-so published something very similar to this? You know, that is helpful because you can say, oh gosh, how did I not get that in my lit review, and look at that project and see maybe how you can spin yours different. But if it's just like, oh, you know, your retrospective design is bad, like, how much can you really do with that? You know, you just have to try somewhere else. So I would say in the setting of rejection, best to not bring yourself down too much with the comments. A brief review and, you know, some venting over a coffee break is probably a good idea. And then resubmit it as soon as possible. Because again, you know, the review times are prolonged, of course.
And then I guess we could just touch on lessons learned before we move on to the open comment session. So May and I, people probably know, have published a lot together. We were looking, and about 40 of our publications are combined. And so having that person to lean on, like May said, if one of us gets the reviewer comments and we're a little bit down, you know, talking to the other person, brainstorming and looking at how you can work together. And, you know, one person usually can point something out about what should the next step be. But I think it's helpful to have that other team member that you can talk to, go back to the drawing board, and then reapproach. I do really like May's suggestion. We always make that table. I think that's really helpful when you get the reviewer comments, to separate them all out. It can be kind of daunting when you get the email and it's like all in paragraph form, but to pull them out, put them in a table and kind of group them together, because sometimes the different reviewers have similar comments. That's really helped us keep it organized, make sure we address all the comments before we resubmit. What lessons, I guess, have you learned, May? It's kind of a broad question there.
Definitely. Like, writing the paper from day one of the project is key. You know, you've done your lit search, you obviously have to do it again when you get closer to the end to make sure you're not missing anything. But like, then you're constantly thinking in the mindset of like, this manuscript is the goal, not so much like the results, although of course they're the most fun. So you remember like things that peer reviewers have perhaps mentioned in the past that were issues. And then, yeah, like, you just cannot give up. Like, I think us as transplant pharmacists, we're used to being shot down, right? We're the best to publish. Like, we say, oh, you know, I think that TAC dose of 2 milligrams twice a day isn't going to be enough for this guy whose BMI is 56. And they say, oh, sure. What do you know? You know, and we're like, okay, we'll see what comes tomorrow. And that's what you need to remember while you're writing these papers. It's just like clinical practice. Like, you can't be bogged down by one person's opinion of what you've done. You have to know for yourself that, you know, what you've done is great work and it's important, even if it's a very niche, you know, research setting or project. Like, we can't all maybe do these great surveys and things that Alicia has done. You know, sometimes we just are trying to do QI on our small patient population, but our findings are very helpful and you think that they're probably applicable to a lot of, the transplant population out there. And there's a place for that, as well as there's a place for any, white paper on the role of the transplant pharmacist. So the best thing is just try not to get discouraged and approach, the review process and the submission process in a very pharmacist way of step by step and regimented, and you'll get to the end and it'll be worth it. Then you'll be ready for the next one because we're also masochists as pharmacists.
I think that's the end for our section, so we'll punt it back to the lead.
Thanks very much, ladies, and thanks very much to all of our speakers. This was just really great, insightful advice and experiences for all of our viewers. I know we all feel that pharmacists are really important in the research process, especially in a field such as transplant. I'd like to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please go ahead and submit them to the chat feature and specify if they are for a particular speaker. We do have a couple coming through, so I'll start to pose them for the group for our last 10 minutes of the session here. I'll actually start off with one that I was really interested in as well. This question is for Jamie. Jamie, we loved your insight on being intentional, thinking about goals and timeline for resident and student learners. I know many of us work to formulate project ideas and goals before the resident even starts on site. And since your IRB is submitted even before July, it sounds like, does that include defining outcomes and variables? And if so, do you find that the resident can still develop critical thinking skills about how to develop their own ways of data collection points and making outcomes impactful?
Great question. Yes, IRB rules for retrospective data, even if it's retrospective data, I think we need to spell out which data that you are going to collect. So that is what I mean by the PI or research mentor need to do a lot of homework way in advance, because you need to have that protocol included in the IRB. So how can we give opportunities for our new residents to develop? You don't share IRB application. Just probably discuss and have them give them opportunity to do their own research. And then based on what they heard from you about what is the research question, and let them write the study aim and hypothesis and come up with which data points to be included, what is the primary and secondary outcomes that need to be collected. And I don't know, depending on the programs, and your program may require actually written proposal in 4 sentences. Some of them just want bullet points, or some of them just a slide presentation, like a 10-minute presentation. So no matter what, the content is very important, right? So think through and guide step-by-step your residents so that the resident will have full immersed experience, despite that the PI already have done the preliminary work and getting IRB approval.
That's such a really great strategy. I didn't think about that, to actually not physically share the IRB submission with them. It's a nice way to still facilitate their learning. The next question is for Margaret and Jillian. How do you handle a reviewer comment that you don't agree with and perhaps do not wish to change the context of your point being made within the publication? As such, is it okay not to make a change in response to the reviewer comment?
Well, you must respond to every comment, but we're a very manipulative healthcare practitioner, I think. And so you can respond in a way that, essentially says, I disagree and I'm not going to change it, while agreeing with them. So Jillian can attest to this. When we respond to reviewers, we are like the ooziest, gooeyest, nicest response ever. Oh, thank you for your comment. Thank you for this insightful feedback. We appreciate it. It's going to improve the quality of this piece, like every single question. But sometimes they'll say, okay, this project was about, BK nephritis or something like that. We would like you to review and include in a table every single paper that was written about BK arthritis or something, and then break it into, what therapies were used and this and that. But your project was just a case report. And you say, well, I don't believe that's within the scope because the amount of, energy and time it would take to include all those publications would be extensive. And so this is like a true life example. And then you turn it back to the reviewers, they come back and they say, oh no, I'm sorry, we really do want you to do that. Well, at that point, you're going to have to buckle down and do it. And I can say, even if it is a lot of work, it usually is worthwhile because then they accept it and you're good. And maybe somebody can use that excellent review of the literature that you sunk all this time into. So.
Thanks, Margaret. That's insightful. I certainly can attest to the laying it on thick in terms of the responses. So another question for Alicia. So it sounds like collaboration across different institutions can be very daunting. Do you have any sort of best tips specifically for new practitioners who would be interested in working towards this avenue?
Work with people you enjoy. Like, I think finding your team, I mean, it took me a long time to find the same group of people that that can work with this phenotype of weird and ADHD. I think it just takes time. I would say don't always focus on the research. Like, I think my desire for research and my desire to do collaborative research really was born out of my service commitments on the different committees that I was sitting on. And using that, to help, further define and further hone like my vision for my career. That's how, I've been able to work with a lot of different people. May and Jillian were co-chairs of the research committee and like longtime research members of that committee when I was just sitting on it as a brand new practitioner out of fellowship. That's how, I've met Jamie. Really just finding people that you enjoy working with. And, the projects will come with time. I think that, as new residents, I think getting your feet wet in terms of service volunteering will help you find your people within the transplant space. And then focusing on just helping and working on those internal projects. That's going to help you figure out, okay, like, this is what I'm able to do internal. How can I expand that out? Or what can I contribute on a more national platform? But I think the combination of working internally first, having patience, and then finding, collaboration through professional like committee work and service involvement is kind of how I found my people. And then breweries at conferences. So, it doesn't always have to be so formal. I think just making it fun for you is what's going to make it successful.
Definitely some wise wisdom there. We have 2 more questions in our chat. We'll try and get through those. We have a question. Can you reflect, and it looks like this is for any of our panelists, can you reflect on any experience you have on transitioning an incomplete project from one learner to another when the first learner graduates or lost interest or availability to the project?
Have a transition plan.
Yeah, and I would say the most important thing is that you care about the project. Like, the residents will help you, but there's only one person usually who really cares about the project, whose idea it was, who noticed the niche problem, who wants to solve this through QI. And you need that person because that person is going to shepherd the project all the way to the end. And if that's you, just remember, like, they are residents, they're going to leave, new ones are going to come. Like, find something that has, an easy start and stop. Like, we need you to collect this 100 patients data, and then remember that you're going to have to go through and probably fix it to some degree. And maybe you'll be lucky enough that they're a student and they stay on as a P2I1 and they're really interested and they help write the paper. But I would say that is lucky. So it's good to be the one who, cares about the project, keeps it moving forward, and that's how you'll be successful.
Yeah, the witness protection program works extra hard to keep up with all their graduating residents that are disinterested in their research projects. So you have to care.
Exactly.
Where do they go? We don't know. I mean, just have a transition plan. You know, you don't want the resident to ghost you or to not be clear on like the shared vision and timeline. You know, I usually have a learner in my pocket if that resident can't continue on pushing that project forward that might be interested in assuming those responsibilities. Sometimes, you know, if the resident really cares, or they're going to help you with that transition. If they're not interested in the project, you know, I can't underscore what May said, like you got to care or it's not going to get to the finish line. It's going to go to the aisle of misfit toys and that's where it's going to live. So,
Right.
you
And I
know,
would say like, you will learn your own level of crazy if you lose this data. So try to be the one who like keeps the Excel file. Don't let them leave and never have sent it to you. I personally have stalked someone out on Facebook to get them to send me the data file so that we could finish the project, because reviewers often ask for additional analysis and you don't want to say, I'm sorry, the data is no longer available, because that will be a difficult sell.
or you could just use that in your reasons why we can't do it.
Yeah.
But sorry. Oops. But also reality. It's happened to, I think definitely has happened to me, and it sounds like it's happened to me as well.
Well, we have hit our 3 o'clock hour. We want to thank all of our speakers again today and thank our audience for joining us. As a reminder, additional information will be sent out via email with steps to obtain CE credit. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and hope to see you at our next professional development series session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.